Morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm the director of the Central Asia program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So welcome everyone to the Central Asia program seminars, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion on an issue which is as urgent as it is timely. I mean, the integrity of global climate action under the UN's banner. And as we all know, as we meet here today, representatives from around the world are gathering in Baku, Azerbaijan for COP29. And this year's climate summit comes at a critical moment, not only in terms of addressing the urgent climate crisis, but also in protecting the integrity of these multilateral negotiations against undue influence and corruption. And so today, this seminar will explore questions related to environmental issues, corruption, and civil society in the context of COP29. We'll also hear insights from the Anti-Corruption Data Collective and Transparency International latest report, which sounds an alarm about significant vulnerabilities in the structure of this year's COP, including the influence of corporate interest with close links between conference organizers and Azerbaijan state-owned company SOCAR. So in this report, the questions are raised about contracting practices, potential conflicts of interest, and the possibilities that these forces could undercut the outcomes of COP29. So, this seminar will explore actually the broader implications of these findings for multilateral climate action, and even maybe consider paths towards changes, towards reforms. So to address all these complex and sensitive issues, we have a panel of 4 experts today: Ms. Kate Waller, Mr. Emin Bayramli, Mr. Karl Horberg, and Mr. David Zakwani. So each of them is going to present about 10 minutes, then we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to send me your question in the chat box. So thank you all for being with us. I would like to thank David for having initiated and organized this event. So we'll start with our first speaker, who will be Kate Waters, who is a co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, which is an environmental and human rights nonprofit that works with oil and gas impacted communities in the Caspian Sea Basin, including in Azerbaijan. And Kate has worked on and extensively written about environmental, human rights, and climate issues in Azerbaijan. So, Kate, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for that kind introduction, and thank you, David, for the excellent report that you all have launched and put together. It's really an honor to be part of this panel and to have an opportunity to speak about these issues, especially as we're into the final day of the first week of COP29, which I think we can probably all agree has been pretty tumultuous and fraught. So I want to focus my remarks sort of on 2 areas this morning connected to the report that ACDC and Transparency International have put out, but also to put that into the context of the area that Crude Accountability works in, which is, as Sebastian said, is looking at the impact of fossil fuels on human rights and on local communities and on the environment in the Caspian Sea Basin, including in Azerbaijan. And we've been working in, in Azerbaijan for over 20 years. And although what we're seeing happening right now is certainly very, very concerning, what's going on at the COP right now is not happening in a vacuum. This is not a surprise. This is not something new and different. It's worse than it's been, but this is not a change from where the Azerbaijani government and the Azerbaijani state have focused their energies, particularly with regard to climate and environment and also to human rights. the report that David's going to talk about, I don't want to steal his thunder, but in the executive summary, he and in the report itself, it warns of 4 risks of COP29. And I think that we are seeing at the end of this first week that all 4 of those risks are certainly very, very real and very, very urgent. The influence and capture by corporate interests is one, that the COP29 would become a forum for fossil fuel lobbying and deal making, that we would see action by kleptocracies and autocrats and oligarchs, and finally that we would see greenwashing. And I think all it takes is a look at even the headlines that have been coming out of the press over the course of the last week, never mind talking with more knowledgeable people on the ground or activists and journalists from Azerbaijan, those who are still able to speak out. And my colleagues are going to talk more about the repression that they're facing. But it's very clear that this is what is happening in Azerbaijan. This is a captured COP, not surprising. We all know this is the 3rd year in a row that the COP has been hosted by in a country with serious human rights concerns and also with major, major fossil fuel investments that are really driving the energy decisions that the country makes, and also the economy. Crude Accountability has been doing some serious research and work on this, and actually on Monday we're going to be publishing a paper that looks into some of the investments in the fossil fuel sector and in the economy more broadly. But I just want to just set the context a little bit here with some figures. BP, which is the largest foreign investor in Azerbaijan and has been there essentially since the country was created, has invested 85 billion, that's a B, billion dollars in Azerbaijan in the oil and gas sector. There have been little investments here and there in renewables, but primarily we're talking about investments in the fossil fuel sector. That's massive. And we know that BP is there, and we know that other fossil fuel companies are very present at the COP29. Excuse me, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is one of the big IFI financiers of investments in Azerbaijan, has invested $4 billion with a B dollars in 190 projects. Roughly $1.8 billion of those investments have been in the natural resources sector. So we're talking about a commitment and an investment by the West into Azerbaijan's energy sector, fossil fuel sector, that is really, really significant. We know that over 90% of the energy sector in Azerbaijan is operated from fossil fuels. So this is a massive, massive sector. And although COP29 is supposed to be about finding climate solutions, including reducing emissions and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, President Aliyev has been absolutely blatant in his statements that Azerbaijan is digging in even further into its fossil fuel investments. He has said twice now in public, most recently earlier this week in Baku, that oil and gas is a gift from God, and they're going to continue to invest, and that Azerbaijan is planning to expand, not reduce, its fossil fuel portfolio and its fossil fuel investments and development over the course of this year. BP pulled back from a statement saying that it was going to reduce its fossil fuel investments to actually expanding them because of stakeholder requirements and stakeholder needs. And we know that a lot of those investments are taking place in Azerbaijan. So this is really a concern about capturing of this, what is supposed to be this massive, climate meeting, to really turning into an investment opportunity for big oil and for other corporations. I want to talk just very briefly. I know Karl and others are going to talk more about the human rights sector, but I want to talk just a little bit about how the repression in Azerbaijan has impacted climate activists, environmental defenders, and journalists who report on environmental issues and on the fossil fuel sector. And there's been, as we know, a massive, massive crackdown there. And BBC yesterday did an interview with very brave Gubad Ibadoghlu, who is under house arrest right now. And the BBC asked the government of Azerbaijan for a comment about, sort of the claims of repression that were taking place in Azerbaijan. The government refused to make a statement or to make a comment to BBC, but issued a written statement from the Azerbaijani embassy in the UK, which said, among other things, we strongly reject that there are political prisoners in Azerbaijan. And went on to say these types of allegations, so allegations that there are political prisoners, are most unhelpful and disruptive for international relations. So this is not an administration, if you want to use that word politely, this is not a regime that is interested in diplomatically finding solutions to move forward with the international community. They have doubled down. They have been belligerent, if you can use that kind of language, in their defense of fossil fuels, in their defense of repression, in their defense of the model that they have chosen as the COP29 goes forward. And just taking a quick look at headlines this morning, it looks like the COP is sort of unraveling because of Aliyev's and his administration's inability to kind of manage the types of negotiations and the conversations that are taking place there. So the question is, how are they going to manage massively important climate negotiations on this defensive posture? So I think there are a lot of concerns. I'm going to stop there, but I think there are massive concerns about this, and really hope that the UNFCCC will reconsider the decision-making process about who hosts COPs in the future and how to move forward an agenda in the climate arena that has any hope of any sort of effectiveness and possibility for positive movement forward. Never mind our hopes for the freeing of all 319 political prisoners being held in Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Our next speaker is Emin Bayramli, who is a Rutgers University graduate with a degree in statistics, who has been focusing on advocating for the release of Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu that Kate mentioned, and over the 300 other prisoners in Azerbaijan. And over the past 14 months, Emin has worked to hold Azerbaijan accountable for its actions and to push for justice reform. And his goal is to positively impact the legal system and support families affected by wrongful incarceration. So, Emin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And again, I want to thank David for perfect paper that they have done. It really explains everything and gives suggestions too. That's something that is very useful from time to time, to have suggestions on what kind of actions we should take regarding Azerbaijan, also the COP29, and coming in the future other conferences regarding this caliber. I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Emin Bayramli. I'm the youngest son of Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu. And I'll give a bit of a briefing information about who I am and who my father is. I'm the youngest son of Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu, who's a professor and has had positions at Rutgers University before, where I graduated this year, but previously has taught at Duke, UNC, and was a former National Democracy Fellow in 2015. I know my father is a political prisoner because when I walked in the street with him, people will stop him and thank him for his work. I know my father is a political prisoner because every time I open Facebook, I see people saying, free Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu, free others. Azerbaijan does have political prisoners, and we have a lot of them, but that also means that we're fighting. Our prisons are full of people because we are fighting. That's why people go there. And Azerbaijani government knows that. Doesn't matter how much they could try to greenwash it, whitewash it, bring a Formula One to the country. Regardless of that, people will protest. We even had a protest today at the COP29, animal rights activist who protested the fact that Azerbaijani government, before the 2015 newly made Baku Olympic Games, they started killing street dogs on the street and taking them into dog processing places where they would shoot them. And this is one of the ways that people protest, was went into the COP, and he was detained out of the COP and was taken out of the building. My father, Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu, who was on the board of EITI before, has worked tremendously a lot regarding governance and good governance and transparency in the country. And, there was real hopes in starting from the 2000s to change the country. However, in July 21st, 2023, my dad traveled back to Azerbaijan to see my grandma who has been hospitalized. And they arrested my dad and they arrested my mom with it. They dragged my mom on the floor and 8 police officers ruthlessly beat her to a point, and they put a black bag on her head and took her to a terrorist cell in the organized crime unit building, which is the most notorious crime unit building, is known for raping people and other things, but has been sanctioned by the U.S. State Department in 2023 for one individual has been sanctioned from there because they were raping and torturing inmates there. My mom was kept for 8 hours in that prison and was let go. And first thing my mom did was ran home and tried to grab my dad's pills to bring back in. They didn't let it. They didn't allow it. I was in New Jersey. First thing I did was to go down to the DC on the Sunday night, and I didn't know what to do. I really didn't know how to, proceed with it. But I realized there is a lot of organizations like Crude Accountability, Freedom Now, who was there to help me and help my family, navigate through these hard times and also understand how the system works. For a time, for the 10 months my dad was in prison, we, our family worked with Crude Accountability, Freedom Now, Human Rights Watch a lot, and got a lot of ideas to do so. And the first thing we realized was to run to the Congress to ask for justice. Given if you're in the United States or if you're an American and so on, you have the right to go to Congress and ask them to do something. And that was the biggest privilege I had. I was able to go to the Congress and ask individuals and Congress people and staffers who are very understanding in many matters to help us and help my family. In the 10 months my dad was there, they refused doctor visits. They refused family visits time to time. They refused Red Cross visits to my father. In the beginning, they kept him in a 6-room, 20-meter square, a 6 people, 20-meter square room where the hygiene was non-existent. And this is the tactics Azerbaijani government employ. They want to threaten people, but also they want to make them sick. Their main goal was to make my dad sick in there, and they did it. They managed to get him sick. My dad is in a house arrest in a tremendously, facing health problems. And that's one of the things that Azerbaijani government does, because they want to eliminate any civil society that is left in the country. And that's their goal in Azerbaijan right now, with 319 people and plus being in prison. They're all living in tremendously unhealthy situations, but also they're not provided any medical help, also, if any, efficient. And that's the problem we are facing, is that we desperately need attention in the country. COP29 brought attention that Azerbaijani government didn't want. It brought the attention of political prisoners. It brought the attention of human rights. It brought the attention of the fact that press media does not exist. Freedom of media does not exist. This is true for my family. My dad started around 3 newspapers and 2 journals. All were shut down by the Azerbaijani government. A quick story is that after my parents got married, my dad worked on a newspaper and published The Face of Ilham Aliyev in 1997. Back then, he was the president's son, and called him a gambler. My dad came home at 5 a.m. After publishing it. The newspaper was sold out. At 7 a.m., they came to pick up my dad. They put him in a detention center. I remember days I woke up at 3 a.m. I saw my father coming home, and he had a bloody face. And when I asked him, he told me somebody just tried to steal my car, so that's why. But I know that's not the truth. My mom tells us the stories of 2003 riots where my dad and others had to disappear and go into hiding while all the families were getting called and getting threatened by the Azerbaijani government. We have a story of my dad was sent to get a prescription for my older brother, and he was detained in the front of the house and didn't come back for 2 days. These are the stories that we live with, and these are the stories that is the reason why we are fighting. We're fighting for independent Azerbaijan, and we do need help a lot in terms of, I know many of you guys have voices in the U.S. Congress, and it could call your congressman to concern and say the fact that we need help. Just given the fact that we have a new administration coming in, challenge or not, we have a blank canvas that we could draw ourselves and make the policies, but we need to act fast before Azerbaijanis does. My dad's story is one out of 319, and there is many more that we do not know about. I wanted to quickly add on the COP29 a bit. I know some of you guys might have seen the Global Witnesses fake oil company scheme, where they opened a fake oil company and made the Kate could correct me, or Karl was the CEO of COP29, and they were trying to make deals in the background. But this is no surprise to us. This is the first thing we told them to, not to give it to Azerbaijan. After all, Ilham said this was a God-given right to them. I kind of think God hates my people, because this is a black curse that we have seen that has not given us independence for the last 100 days. And we live with it. Every day I wake up trying to see what I could do regarding my dad's case. And the days that I can't do a lot, I feel bad. On the Saturdays and Sundays, I try to write names and see who could reach out to. And this is what Azerbaijani people do now, because their loved ones are in prison. And desperate it is, there's a reason for it, because like I said, we are fighting, we are putting our concerns there. We are saying that this regime cannot go on. And we need help on the Western countries to amplify our voices and bring them to the Azerbaijani government and push them to do more. Because that's where it stands at the end of the day, is that Azerbaijan is an oil selling country. And I heard from the State Department when I was at meeting in them, is that usually the customer is right. But in this case, somehow the seller is right. And we have to, do the things that Azerbaijan says because they sell us oil. But after all, they make money out of this. And that's the thing that they do. And that seems to be the consensus that the US Congress has came up to, is that Azerbaijan needs us. We don't need Azerbaijan. They need to sell their gas. The Europe is a buyer. And that's how it should process. We shouldn't be tempting or bowing down to their needs. They should be bowing down to our needs. And I think that's something that should be pushed, and should be more vocal about the fact that the Europe needs to stand up for itself, but also Europe needs to start demanding more human rights and more adequate treatment of people. And one thing I want to add is that we need doctors in the country. We need doctors that are able to visit. We need doctors that could see the political prisoners, including my father, because that's something that is very desperate. We have gone from asking for them to be freed to asking them to at least bring a doctor, because that is an immediate need that we need. And again, I thank Sebastian, and I thank David, and I thank others that invited me here to speak today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emin. I mean, I should thank you for having accepted, to share your dad's and your own difficult and sad experience. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Karl Horberg, who is a program director of Freedom Now, which is a human rights organization that protects individuals and communities from government repression and defends human rights through direct legal support, targeted high leverage advocacy and capacity building assistance. For more than 10 years, Karl has campaigned for the release of political prisoners around the world, including more than 24 individuals wrongfully imprisoned in Azerbaijan. And previously, he was an operations manager for a grant writing consulting firm and a program officer for Connect U.S. funds. Karl served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Balykchy in Kyrgyzstan from 2004 to 2006, and he holds a BA in political science from American University and an MS in human rights from the London School of Economics. So Karl, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you, David, for organizing this event and for the great report you issued. As Sebastian mentioned, yes, I've worked on Azerbaijan for a long time, and I see some familiar names in the participant list as well, who I know have worked on Azerbaijan for even longer. And unfortunately, I can tell you, and they can tell you, that this is a well-worn pattern for Azerbaijan, not only in terms of repression. They've had various civil society crackdowns going back more than a decade, but also in terms of corruption. The issues we're seeing with SOCAR and COP have been happening for years and years. And I actually want to use this time to talk a little more about the linkages between corruption and repression in Azerbaijan, because the two very much go arm in arm. And the two facets I would very much like to discuss are, the first is how corruption is used to mask Azerbaijan's human rights abuses, And the second is how this corruption drives those abuses. And I'll start out by saying what is already obvious, and which Kate and Emin have already touched on, which is that Azerbaijan is a petrostate. Its economy is dominated by oil and gas, which account for 48% of its GDP and 93% of its export revenue. The World Bank did a comparison of the proportion of countries' income from natural resources to GDP, and in that comparison, Azerbaijan ranks 11th in the world, ahead of countries like Qatar and Kuwait and Venezuela. And as the report that we're discussing goes into in detail, the oil and gas sector in Azerbaijan is run by SOCAR, the state oil company of Azerbaijan, which is effectively an arm of the government. Its supervisory committee is appointed by the president, who was a former SOCAR executive himself. And much of that income that SOCAR is bringing in, $50 billion in revenue in 2023, is heading into government coffers. How is that money spent? Well, a significant amount of it is spent on a global public relations and lobbying campaign to improve the image of Azerbaijan in the Western world. Azerbaijan has used this tactic so often and to such a great extent, it has its own name, caviar diplomacy. Investigations by the European Stability Initiative discovered that in 2012, 2013, Azerbaijan had a group of about a dozen individuals in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. It was sending half a kilogram shipments of caviar to 4 times a year and paying for lavish trips. Unsurprisingly, these individuals blunted any criticism of Azerbaijan in pace. In 2013, SOCAR secretly funded a trip for 10 members of the U.S. Congress and more than 24 members of their staff to Azerbaijan. An ethics report indicated that SOCAR spent nearly $750,000 that it funneled through nonprofit organizations to disguise the origin of these funds. One of the members on that trip was Henry Kuehler from Texas. He was indicted earlier this year on money laundering and bribery charges for allegedly accepting nearly $600,000 from Azerbaijan to help influence U.S. foreign policy. In 2017, thanks to reporting from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, we learned the massive extent of this campaign. Azerbaijan spent $2.9 billion between 2012 and 2014 to curry influence, pay lobbyists, apologists, and to launder cash. The scheme, known as the Azerbaijani laundromat, spent money in Germany, the UK, France, Turkey, Iran, and Kazakhstan. The source of the money is not always clear, but it came from companies linked to President Aliyev, state ministers, and the International Bank of Azerbaijan. So this is how the money is being spent: to cover up the abuses, to paint a sunny picture of a progressive, right-respecting nation, and to purchase allies. But it's also fueling abuses. How? Well, much of what we know today about Azerbaijan's corruption comes from journalists reporting on the ground. But the government has very little tolerance for this type of reporting, especially if it concerns President Aliyev's family and close circle. Thus, those journalists are often targeted for arrests. And a few examples include Khadija Ismailova, who was arrested and imprisoned between 2014 and 2016. In the years leading up to her arrest, she produced a number of pieces dealing shady financial dealings of President Aliyev's family, including that his son, who was 11 years old at the time, owned real estate in the United Arab Emirates worth $44 million, and that offshore companies were registered in the name of Aliyev's daughters. Mehman Husseinov was in prison between 2017 and 2019 after he began a social media campaign entitled Hunt for Corrupt Officials. Afgan Mukhtarli was in prison between 2018 and 2020 after he was abducted in Tbilisi, Georgia. At the time, he was investigating President Aliyev's business networks. Currently, there are at least 14 journalists in prison in Azerbaijan, most of them associated with Abzas Media and Toplum TV, where Khadija is currently the editor-in-chief. At the time when they were arrested late last year and early this year, they were doing important work looking into corruption, and now they're all facing lengthy prison sentences. Ironically, most of them are facing charges of smuggling foreign currency, as the Azerbaijani government claims they're being paid by Western governments to disparage Azerbaijan. But the abuses caused by corruption are wider than imprisoned journalists. Because of corruption, the government is naturally neglecting its citizens, not providing them with necessary services, and allowing the gap between the elite and the ordinary citizens to grow. We can see some of this on display at COP now, where hotel rooms and food are outrageously priced in Baku, shutting out many of the local civil society organizations for participating in the event. Additionally, the Azerbaijani government has made it largely impossible for individuals to create independent organizations that can address social and economic issues. For more than a decade, Azerbaijan's NGO laws have greatly restricted civil society, effectively prohibiting anyone critical of the government to officially register an NGO and thus receive foreign funding. For instance, in early 2023, an activist attempted twice to register a regional NGO that offered legal aid and support to a local community with the aim of resolving social and environmental concerns. The first time the activist registered, the government claimed the application was rejected because all the founders had not signed the application. The second time, the government claimed state agencies were already doing the work dealing with social issues in the region, thus the organization had no reason to exist. So this is the type of repressive environment that corruption has produced. One where no voices can criticize the government, and one where no independent organizations can offer solutions. And with that, I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl. Our last speaker will be David Zacconi, who is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University here, who is also the co-director of Ponars Eurasia and co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. David's academic research focuses on corruption, clientelism, and political economy in Russia, Western Europe, and the United States. And his most recent book, Politics for Profit, Business, Elections, and Policy Making in Russia, which was published by Cambridge Studies in Comparative Studies in 2020, examines why business people run for political office and how their firms benefit. David has also led many investigations into political corruption and opacity in the private equity and real estate industries, published in several newspapers or journals, including the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the Daily Beast, and the Miami Herald, among other outlets. And David received his PhD in political science from Columbia University and his BA from the University of Virginia. So before giving the floor to David, I just would like to remind to our audience that after David's presentation, we're going to start the Q&A session. So please feel free to send me your question in the Q&A chat box. Thank you. The floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you to the Central Asia program at GW and IRIS for putting on this really timely and I think important event. I also want to thank Kate, Emin, and Karl for the really thought-provoking and moving remarks about this multitude of issues right now surrounding COP and also just Azerbaijan writ large. We convened this event really to kind of bring many of these issues to the table, to a public forum, and spark a discussion around a report that, two non-governmental organizations, Transparency International and the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, which I co-founded and work with on, in addition to my work at GW, released a couple of weeks ago about the risk that we saw for conflicts of interest and corruption and undue influence dominating this COP29 event. And as Kate hinted at, we highlighted 4 different risks in the report and tried to draw attention to all the myriad ways that corporate and political interests could exploit this convening to push their bottom line rather than to preserve the integrity of the event and pursue real change to environmental policy around the world. And I think Kate correctly said that regrettably, all 4 risks seem to have come to pass in only a week in, and it seems like we're already seeing the things that we were most worried about, and it's distressing. But I think the report also tries to put forward a path that this isn't inevitable, that there are going to be future COPs, and there are things that we can do in civil society or with our access to policymakers or in the media to try to change the status quo and prevent these critical events at the international level from being taken over by either the host governments or corporate interests or fossil fuel interests or whoever's vying for more power at them. So although I'm disturbed by the events that have happened so far, I still want to kind of point out that there may be a light at the end of the tunnel, and that there's some real recommendations and institutional reforms that I think are feasible to try to prevent this from happening and fix things. So I won't go into too much detail about what's in the report. The link to the report is found in the Zoom chat, and I'm happy to follow up after this and provide more background on what we did. But the two organizations came together and tried to pool a lot of publicly available data around both Azerbaijan's oil and gas industry and its preparations for COP29 over the last 11 months or so since it's been made host. We come up with a fair number of kind of new discoveries about those two different processes and organize those discoveries into really problematic areas that we wanted to focus people's attention on in the run-up to the event. So the first one, for example, is that COP negotiations historically have been really unduly influenced by those corporate interests. And in COP29 itself, the president delegate is a former executive at SOCAR, and SOCAR has really been closely involved as a state-owned oil and gas company, of course, in Azerbaijan, in the preparation of COP, and that its president and members of the supervisory board are really helping organize the summit. I want to remind you again, that Congressperson Henry Queller from Texas has allegedly accepted bribes from SOCAR over the last decade to become a prominent advocate of this company's interests in the U.S. So SOCAR has this history of using its financial resources to get its way and to bring over critical veto players within the policymaking environment to its side. And we see COP29 this on full display. The second risk is that COP can be a forum for fossil fuel diplomacy and deal making. And several of the other panelists talked about this really eye-opening investigative report by Global Witness and BBC that I would love to draw people's attention to, because this piece of kind of undercover investigation really blew the lid open on how these events are manipulated by the oil and gas industry. So just to bring people up to speed, journalists posed as a fake investor and approached the COP29 organizing committee and asked to be a sponsor for the event. It was all done over Zoom. They created a fake company and a backstory, and were able to get the president of COP, get Eltar Sultanov on record, agreeing not only to the conditions that this sponsor put forward, sidelining some of the environmental issues and elevating the financial interests of this company, but it's really just kind of bending over backward and writing follow-up emails connecting this fake sponsor with SOCAR representatives. So it's a really kind of not surprising, but very unfortunate reality around these international events is that money talks, and that organizing committees are very much willing to bend the rules, even if it contradicts the main point of the summit. And we've seen at least 1,773 coal, oil, and gas lobbies that have descended on Baku, according to another recent report. This is really one of the main focuses, unfortunately, at these type of gatherings. And then we've also, I'll speak a little bit less on the corruption and kleptocratic element. I think the other panelists have done a very illuminating job of discussing those. But the final thing the report really touches upon is the greenwashing and public relations aspect of all of this. And we were among the first to discover through a foreign agent registration filing here in the United States that Azerbaijan took out a nearly $5 million contract with one of the big four public relations firms, Teneo. And they've been working since February to polish Azerbaijan's image, and especially around COP29. We organized over 500 contacts and outreach to journalists at all the top publications around the world. And as far as we can tell, successfully secured about a dozen meetings and interviews that were written up promoting the various organizers of COP29 and their perspective on the event. And this public relations firm, of course, has not committed has not broken any laws and has diligently filed with the relevant U.S. government authorities. But their other clients are Saudi Arabia or Oman or United Arab Emirates, and the team that was working on this contract was led by the former head of public relations at British Petroleum, BP. So it's a closed circle in many ways, and the Azerbaijani government has shown this largesse in using its spoils from the oil and gas industry in order to cultivate itself abroad, to greenwash its activities, to launder its reputation, and to use high-powered, very talented, competent individuals abroad in order to forward those and achieve those aims. So just to kind of wrap up, I think, again, I wanted to touch upon the fact that we did try to think about what could be different next time around. We're going to be here in a year talking about Brazil at COP30. It's not quite the same type of petrostate, but there's a lot of different natural resources that are being exploited in Brazil and a lot of controversy about those. And we tried to put forward a couple concrete areas where we think action should be taken. So beginning with, of course, the choice of the host country. Might be too late for next year, but going forward, the Club of Rome came out today or yesterday saying we need to be more diligent in how we assess the criteria for granting hosting responsibilities to countries going forward to this, and be much more transparent and much more kind of assertive in the way that we want to position the environment at the center and not other interests. We also talk a lot about how we can increase accountability and transparency through disclosure. And there are a bunch of principles and standards, such as the Global Standard on Responsible Climate Lobbying and the United Nations Global Compact, that we have in place, but that are not necessarily being applied to the organization of these events. So almost like COPs are getting a free pass. We've got the infrastructure, we've got the institutions around, and they apply in different areas, but we don't necessarily demand that the sponsors and the corporate participants and the appointed officers follow the same type of conflicts of interest and disclosure laws that we have in place in other areas. So the machinery is there, but we need to come up with a much more streamlined approach and require that the hosts and all their corporate sponsors abide by the same rules that they would elsewhere. I'll kind of wrap up there, but I would want to say that, just kind of looking back on the first week, and I don't want to get out of the gun, but it does seem that whether because of the actions of the Azerbaijani state itself, and they've been bumbling in some ways, and from my perspective, in the way that it's been very outlandish language being used, and several delegations have left, but also I think the organizing side or the civil society side, preparing the groundwork and pointing to people to all the various issues surrounding this event. I'm starting to see that maybe this strategy is working in terms of informing people about the risks at COP29, and that there is some momentum. And it wasn't so clear in the beginning that this event would go this way, but Azerbaijan has definitely starting to feel some heat. And I just want to make sure that we keep up the pressure, and then we continue to coordinate our efforts. And I think I really appreciate all the work that all the other panelists have done on this, and just the open-mindedness that together we can do a lot more. And I don't want to be too optimistic, but I do think that there's a lot more work to be done. But last year in Dubai, or even in previous years, we didn't see necessarily this coming together in the same way, and this public relations attack, maybe not attack, but public relations inquiry so clear so early on. So I try to leave a lot of my remarks on a more positive note rather than just sinking down. But thank you very much to everyone that participated on the panel, and I look forward to the discussion for the rest of the time.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all. For your 4 excellent presentations, which highlight, the multiple challenges we face in the context of this COP29. Particularly the contradictions between the urgent need for climate action and the prevalence of greenwashing, and more broadly the instrumentalization of international events by authoritarian regimes to bolster their image. This is not new, of course. Many authoritarian regimes organize international events, such as sports gatherings, that serve as effective public relations efforts for governments which are seeking recognition despite widespread criticism. But this PR effort by an authoritarian regime is even more troubling when it involves a meeting on an issue as crucial to humanity's future as climate change. So this raises many questions, not only about COP itself and its organization and its impact, but also about the broader challenges of Western engagement, whether by governments or energy companies in countries like Azerbaijan, but also in other authoritarian states. I'm thinking, for example, here about Turkmenistan in Central Asia. And so the urgency of debating and cooperating on climate issues with the international community, including regimes where human rights conditions are dire and civil society, which is an essential tool for addressing environmental challenges, is largely restricted. All of that, I mean, presents a complex dilemma. So the first question would be maybe for you, David, but not only. I mean, how do the issues you identified in this report for the COP29 compare to those seen in previous COP conferences? So, I mean, yeah, again, that's a question for you, David, but maybe other speakers, I mean, feel free to join the conversation, maybe especially you, Kate, with your huge experience with Crude Accountability. Your huge experience to work on Azerbaijan and environmental issues.
Sure, I think we're seeing more of the same here this year. Last year, in the run-up to Dubai and COP28, there was a leak of documents that basically came to the same conclusion, that the organizing committee was opening itself up to undue corporate influence and really facilitating deal making, sometimes not even on the sidelines of the event, but directly at forums connected to the event. And within a couple months after that last year, there were billions of dollars of deals that were seen to have come as a result of this environmental gathering. So I think we should expect the same in the next couple weeks or months, that SOCAR or BP or other affiliated entities may announce partnerships and things. So I think we've seen this directly in the last year. In terms of the number of fossil fuel lobbyists, we have some data that I think it was about 2.5% of the participants last year directly represented the fossil fuel industry. And this year it's about 1.5%. You know, as a statistician, I don't think that's a significantly different, statistically significant difference. It's maybe a little bit of a downhill spiral, but it's still a lot. We're looking at 1,700, and there's also many fewer delegates overall. And so I think it's maybe even more prominent how much those lobbyists are going to be there on the scene. But Kate, I'd love to also hear what you think about how this one compares to other ones that you've tracked.
Yeah, thank you. Just to be transparent, we haven't actually tracked COPs over time, but we've been looking very closely, obviously, at this one. And I think one of the issues for me, and just sort of, you know, anecdotally talking with activists about what happened in Egypt or what happened in the UAE, I think the repression of activists, I mean, this isn't a context, right? A contest of, you know, like who has the worst repression exactly, or who's under the worst stress. But I think the fact that there's been this real silencing of Azerbaijani voices to the point that we don't have many voices. I mean, even with this person who was arrested this morning, who are able to gather in Baku, I think is a significant mark. But what I do want to suggest is something for us to look for in the coming days. Not only the deals and sort of what's happening on the corporate side or on the state side, but what's happening with civil society throughout the region. I think, you know, we know that there have been environmental and climate activists from Central Asia, for example, who are at COP. We know that other activists in the Caucasus region have not attended COP. And so there's a sort of a diversity of opinion about whether being there or not being there is the way to go forward. And we've also heard from, you know, Central Asian activists who've said this is the first time we have the COP in our region, and we really need to have our voices heard. We need to make sure that the climate issues that are important to us as people who live here are on the agenda, not simply the agenda items of people coming from the West or from other parts of the world. So I think watching to see what comes out of COP from that perspective is one thing. Also, I think we need to be very mindful of the fact that there may be repression increasing in Central Asia, for example. What's going to happen to Kazakhstani activists when they get home? What's going to happen to Tajik activists when they get home? What's going to happen to Kyrgyz activists when they come home? So really keeping that level of diligence and attention on the region, and using, I hate that word in this context, but using the COP and the focus and attention that is on this part of the world in the climate context, really for the first time, trying to keep some of that attention there so that the world just doesn't turn away from Baku and turn away from Eurasia and turn away from, the area where we work at the end of next week, and we're on to Brazil, and that was interesting and weird, but where do we go from here? To sort of really build that into our activism and our advocacy as we move forward, and to keep those connections with decision makers and policymakers and all of the folks who we've been able to engage in this conversation, keep them engaged as we move forward. I think that's really, really important.
I would like to,
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead. I mean, yeah.
I would like to add quickly that I think amount of pressure that we have put on, with the newspapers and so on has worked, in my opinion. One of the reasons I'm saying is that COP29 this year doesn't have the high representatives of the U.S. government, doesn't have the high representatives of French government, doesn't have the high representatives of the German government right now. And that's one of the things that I think has worked in terms of, public pressure of these governments to not to go into these games. And Azerbaijan is not the place to talk about climate. And with other problems that are looming with Azerbaijan, with other countries, I think that's one of the reasons why Anthony Blinken didn't go. That's one of the reasons why the head of the USAID didn't go, even though they usually go to almost all the COPs, last three previous ones they have. And that really shows the fact that the public pressure we have put on this COP29 has worked immensely on, swaying some people's opinion and changing them to not to go to this COP29. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Emin. One quick question that I received is, what were the lobbying standards you mentioned? One was the global standards on responsible lobbying. What was the other one?
Sure, yeah, I tried to put it in the chat. One of the other specific recommendations we made is that the host country should only allow sponsorships from entities that demonstrate commitment to the United Nations Global Compact and to the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So trying to impose some standards on where the money's going to come from the corporate sector if it's going to be used to finance these events.
All right, thank you, David. So I received several questions on the role of civil society. So I mean, several questions, several points. First one is, how significant you think is a risk that perceived corporate capture and conflicts of interest might erode public trust in the COP process? And how can civil society and grassroots movements help ensure that COP29 remains focused and the future COP remain focused on genuine climate action rather than corporate interest? And also, what can we really do to help civil society increase their political and financial powers to hold corporations accountable? I've seen, David, that you already answered in the chat box this last question, but maybe it would be good to elaborate on that so everybody can hear your response. And or again, anyone else is welcome to join the conversation. Who wants to take the floor?
I'll start off with the first one, and then maybe other people can take the second too. Does that work? So I think there is this real risk of corporate interests undermining the integrity of COPs going forward. There's not that many other mechanisms that we have to coordinate international action through so many countries. And it's hard enough to get people at the table and negotiate, say, this new number for climate finance that's supposed to come out in the next month or two. There's a lot of really, really, really tough domestic interests that are going to block these negotiations. And if they don't see that other countries are faithfully approaching the table and that there are opportunities for them to be undermined or manipulated by their competing oil and gas industry, people are going to be much less likely to commit to real sacrifices, to commit to real change. And we're not going to see the same level of robust multilateral engagement that this whole process was designed to facilitate. So I think the idea that everybody gets together for 2 weeks and can easily hash out how we're going to fix the planet, I think no one sincerely believes that. It takes a lot of hard work and it takes a lot of serious negotiating. And when civil society is poking holes and showing about all the interests at the table that are corrupting that, it's going to be much harder to get the type of solutions that we need going forward. And I think that's why if we expect the COP to be the forum for these agreements to come out of going forward, we need to fix the organization of the COP as soon as possible before it's too late.
Thank you, David. Anyone wants to elaborate maybe on civil society, its role, or the... Yeah, Emin.
I'll let Kate go first.
Okay.
Go ahead, Emin. Go ahead, and then I'll follow you.
I was going to say that Azerbaijan has given host badges to oil companies and their staffers that are able to, access places that civil society cannot access. And that's one of the problems that we're facing when you give a COP29 to a petrostate. They have very good connections with petrol companies. And so they have access to places where the change does happen, decisions are made. However, the civil society is limited in many ways that they can do, including Azerbaijan. Like my father has, pushed for environmental changes and pushed for, capping the gas production and so on, is, paying the price right now. And that's one of the things that in Azerbaijan, it's very hard for the civil society to do anything because as the minute they start acting on this, they will pay the price after COP. And that's one of the things that we worry about, is that after COP in Azerbaijan, there will be a larger crackdown. And as the light has been shined off from Azerbaijan after COP, we'll see more people being imprisoned, the harsher conditions will be applied. And our family's fear is that my dad will be put back in prison. And that is one of the things that hunt us very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emin. Kate?
Yeah, I think, sort of building on what Emin said, I think one of the fundamental problems is that there is a massive chasm, I think, in the UN structures, in the understanding of what it takes to meet the climate goals of the UN FCCC, particularly in the context of the COPs, and what the role of climate justice is here, and how the role of civil society is really central to making the connection between meeting the numbers and meeting the, sort of the goals that have been set out and what's actually needed in order to do that. I was at a meeting last week, Sebastian was at the meeting too, where one of the climate activists who spoke said, we hear all the time in the international community, we're talking about sectors. He said, we don't live in sectors, we live in communities. And until communities and the needs of communities are incorporated into the systems that create the climate goals, I don't think we have a very good chance to be successful, because it's complicated, as David was saying. This is an extremely, I don't think there is a more complex problem, but the notion that we can sort of set human rights off to the side, we can deal with authoritarians later, we can manage kleptocracy in another venue, and somehow over here we're going to get to the climate goals, is a delusional, I think. We have to address all of those things in the complexity that we are facing them if we're going to make any progress in meeting the climate challenge. And that's messy, and that involves civil society being present. It involves calling out autocrats. It involves addressing the fossil fuel lobby directly and saying, this is not your venue only. Sure, you have a right to be here, but everyone else does too. And the way this is set up now, civil society is over in some little corner, unless the host of the COP, and we've seen who that host has been for the last 3 years, says otherwise. And in the meantime, we have, seemingly well-meaning climate leaders, including the climate envoy for the U.S., not raising human rights issues. If the Aliyev regime, just as one example, is going to lie about everything else, why should we believe them when they say they're going to cut their emissions? And there's no civil society there to actually hold them to account. That's what's missing from these negotiations. Not only, but it's a huge piece that's missing.
Thank you, Kate. Karl, would you like to add anything on that, on civil society? Or
Well, I mean, I wish I had a good answer to this about how civil society can better engage corporations, because we're living in a time where it seems like corporations have nearly unprecedented power. I mean, they seem to be governments in and of themselves. So just to kind of penetrate that seems to be very difficult. I think the other issue that we're facing is that corporations necessarily have very kind of short-term outlooks. They're looking in terms of the next fiscal quarter or the next fiscal year. So don't really take a big picture approach to it. I think one potential solution is to maybe try to rework our messaging when we talk to corporations or financial institutions and say, look, I mean, obviously human rights need to be part of the discussion, but how to frame it in terms of more dollars and cents, right? It may seem like a great idea to partner with an autocrat because they are efficient in certain ways, but in the long term, I mean, that regime is eventually going to fall and there is going to be chaos, which in the long-term financial aspect is going to be problematic. So working to build up and support human rights, to build democracy, is going to lead to stable societies, to stable situations. And that's what corporations need to invest in for their own self-interest. But yeah, that's my thought. I wish I had something better, like I said, to suggest.
no, thank you, Karl. That's very very helpful. Going back to the very issue of corruption, the question is: are there any lessons from anti-corruption work in other global arenas, other global international organizations, like, for example, the WTO or the World Health Organization, wherever, which might help inform more effective safeguards for the COP process? Anyone wants to address
So
that?
I'm not an expert on kind of multilateral institutions in that way. What we propose are not necessarily drawing on the experience of other type of fora, but really just saying there's a basic code of ethics that needs to be revised here. There are conflicts of interest requirements that are in place in the UN, just to do any work with the UN, that are not necessarily being applied evenly across the entirety of the host country's organizing committee, which if you fan outward, it's a lot of people that are playing really critical roles in putting these events on and dealing with corporate sponsors. And there's just very little disclosure, if any, about where they've worked before, what other kind of equity stakes, what are their family connections, how deeply invested are they in improving the environment versus pushing some other type of agenda. The other area that we really kind of push for is with regards to reform are the NGO coalitions that pop up around these COP events that help paint a brighter, rosier picture of the host government, but there's very little scrutiny and there's not really standards of what it means to be a non-governmental organization participating in these coalitions. And I think one thing our report really highlights is how many of the participants and the coalitions that Azerbaijan has put together really have strong connections to the government. They're not independent at all. But if you didn't know that, if you saw their output, if you read their press releases or attended any of their meetings, you would think that there would be a vibrant civil society happening in Azerbaijan, contrary to everything we've heard about in the last hour. So it's kind of like obvious low-hanging fruit about let's scrutinize the people that are in this ecosystem, the organizations that are in this ecosystem, and apply some basic due diligence to where they're coming from, because it's not hard to pull back the curtain just a couple inches and see that there are a lot of incentives for governments to put their own people into these positions. And if we're not watching, they can have their way over the course of those events.
Anyone else? No. All right. So, I mean, I don't see any more questions, but I mean, in any case, we're getting close to the end of this event. But I would like to give our speakers a chance, maybe to wrap up, and maybe, I mean, I know David, you already gave some recommendations, but still, I mean, looking ahead, you, David, and other speakers, so Kate, Emin, and Karl, if you would have some concrete recommendations that would help to ensure that future climate summits are free from, I mean, undue corporate influence, or are there specific reforms, either structural or procedural, that the UNFCCC should prioritize to safeguard the COP's integrity? And generally speaking, please feel free to add any of the remarks you probably didn't have time to mention in your presentation. So how should we start? Let's start with Kate, maybe. Let's go back to the order of the presenters.
Sure. Thank you, Sebastian. I mean, first of all, I want to say thank you to Sebastian and to David and my fellow presenters, and to all of you who are here today for participating in this session. I think it's timely and really important. In terms of, sort of recommendations for moving forward, I think, a lot of what David just said is really important. We need more scrutiny. We need more due diligence. I think that we're in a moment historically right now where, there's sort of assumption, perhaps, that norms will hold and standards are enough, and that folks are coming in with well-meaning, deserves a second look, and that we need to do more to protect the integrity of our international institutions that have been designed to protect the planet, to protect its citizens, to protect our institutions and our way forward. And I think what we're seeing with the COP is sort of a microcosm of the risks that many international institutions are facing right now. And so really, kind of digging deep, holding standards, looking carefully, and as you said, David, pulling back the curtain. It's not hard. If small civil society organizations can identify corruption and kleptocracy and malign intent, so can governments, so can international institutions, so can corporations. And I think corporations, there was a book written probably 30 years ago now, something called, When Corporations Rule the World. I don't think that's a future we want. I think we need to really invest in the watchdogs and in the international institutions that can kind of recalibrate the incredible power and authority that money and kleptocracy and authoritarianism bring with them, and give voice to those who otherwise wouldn't have it. And we have the mechanisms to do it. We just need to enforce them and use them. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Emin, with maybe one more question specifically for you, I was wondering if there's anything that the international community could do for your father to support him that hasn't been done so far. Plus, again, feel free to add any recommendations on the COP29, in the future COPs, and anything you didn't have time to say in your presentation.
Absolutely. There is a lot to do. One of the things that you could go on Twitter and say free Gubad. You could tweet about the case. You could contact a journalist that you know. You could call your congressman. You could call your senator. Depending on where you are, there's always, I'm assuming many have joined in here from a western side of the world where they have the privilege to access their representatives. And these privileges should be used, I think, properly in terms of, if somebody wants to help, they could easily contact their representatives in their respective country. And I think this will make the change, tweeting about it, putting on Facebook, showing what the COP is, showing what Azerbaijan is. I also want to remind people that I'm one of 319 that are not able to be here. I'm privileged enough to be living in the United States, but not many of us have that privilege. And I think I call on people to not only about my dad, but also mention the fact that country is struggling and people are fighting. So that's where we are. And I wanted to say that that's the most important thing you could do is put it on the social media and contact your representatives. That is crucial for us to, because we reach to them, we talk to them, and more people come up to them about this. It's good. More journalists know about this. It's good because then we come up to them about trying to put our side of the story. They listen to us because they have heard it before and they have heard it from their own people. And that's something that really helps us. When it comes to the future COPs, it's going to be in Brazil. So there's a lot of hopes. And this COP was supposed to be like a stepping stone to going into Brazil. And I read an article by CNN that said that everybody knew that the US elections will influence and will shake the COP29, but nobody actually saw that the government itself is hosting, will be working on it to shake COP29, which is what we're saying with Ilham Aliyev. I want to add the fact that the president of Azerbaijan went on the stage twice and started shaking countries like a mob boss. And this isn't a COP. At this point, in my opinion, this is a joke. That we went from, we're in such a low place in terms of COP29 comes in. I pray to God that the COP30 would be better than this, because there's no low point than that of the president going on the stage and threatening other countries and putting their propaganda out there, calling the newspapers lobby paid, even though they're the one who's paying lobby groups to go put good names on it. And David could talk about that, and he did. And so that's one of the things that we see is that he's using COP29 is not an environmental stage, not a stage about making changes. This is for them to call in people and show, I call the shots in this country, and whatever you say, it doesn't matter for us. And this is outrageous because this was supposed to be about quick action about the environmental problems that we are facing, and none of them will come true. And in my opinion, like Kate said, that how can we believe them if they're just bluntly lying nonstop to our faces? And again, I call people to reach out, people around them. As more people speak, as more people tell my dad's name, Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu, the more help we get, and more people will reach out to us later on, because it's not hard to find us. We're on social media, and when you search up Gubad Ibadoghlu, our tweets come out instantly, and that's one of the things that we do. And again, I thank David, I thank you, Sebastian, and thank Carl and Kate being here and speaking about my country and the problems that we're facing. And again, I thank you all.
Thank you so much, Emin. Karl?
I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that climate change is, one of, if not the most important issues we're facing. It affects every single human being and future generations of human beings. And the circle of people who get to decide the venue where this is discussed and the terms of those discussions is frustratingly small. So I echo Kate's recommendation that the process needs to be more open. And I think it needs to be more transparent as well. I mean, we saw that the host country agreement with Azerbaijan, I still don't think it's been made public. I know Human Rights Watch got a copy of a leaked version and released it, but there were no rights protections within that for civil society. So I think there needs to be a more open discussion about kind of the terms, about where COP is being held. All of that needs to that process, I think, in general, just needs to be revised. Yeah, those are my general thoughts.
Thank you, Karl. And last but definitely not least, David.
Yeah, we're coming up to the end, so I won't take up too much more of people's Friday mornings. But I think echoing everything that Kate, Emin, and Carl said, I would just add really responsible business engagement as well as the other thing. That there's always going to be corporate participation. Like Kate said, we can't restrict people from participating. But there are some businesses that are more generally committed to the goals of the UNFCCC and some that are less committed. And we need to scrutinize the way that we interact with these companies, the same level that we scrutinize how we interact with authoritarian regimes that oftentimes vie for hosting. So it's a multifaceted venue for a lot of different types of interests. And I think all of us on this call have highlighted the various different problems. And I would just end with the corporations at the end of the day oftentimes have the most money or are the most significantly invested in subverting a lot of these critical negotiations processes. So I want to make sure that we keep the spotlight on them as well as the governments as we move forward in the next round of negotiations. I also want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, as well as to everyone that stuck around and joined us and participated on the Zoom call. And thank you, Sebastian and the Central Asia Program for putting on a wonderful event that I think really raised a lot of critical challenges for this week's event and going into next week.
Thank you so much, David, but also Kate, Emin, and Karl for your very insightful presentations for this discussion, but also for your dedication to working to addressing such a critical issue, which is climate change and the ways in which corruption and authoritarianism can hinder the fight against it. So, and I highly recommend reading David's report and also keeping up, with activities and publications of Crude Accountability and Freedom Now. I would like to thank our audience for being with us, for your questions, and we look forward to having you again in our Central Asian Program seminars. Thank you again and have a good day. Goodbye.